radio for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network.
All right. Good evening, Fade to Black. How you doing? Today's Thursday, February 15th, 2024. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Man, oh man, it's going to go down tonight. All of my favorite subjects all wrapped up in one show. Our guest tonight, Dr. Damon Abraham, is with us. Technology meets Psi. Yeah, tech meets Psi, parapsychology, all of that consciousness. We're getting into everything tonight, and I am really looking forward to this conversation. So buckle up, kids. Here we go. It's time to get your knowledge on. Yeah. Remember back in the day, I would say, tonight, it's time for your edumacation. That's what we're going to do tonight. Yeah, all that and much more. Help support the show. Help support what we do around here. Get yourself a Fade to Black t-shirt. The links are below. 2 t-shirts, 2 ways to get them. And if you get a Game Changer membership, you not only get that autographed t-shirt, that's right, and you get your shipping, but you're going to get Fade to Black blend coffee. That's right. Yeah. And if you don't have a coffee grinder, you're going to have one after you get your Game Changer membership because you got to grind those beans. All right. So get your t-shirts today. I mentioned this yesterday, and I think I did it again this morning. For the last, for the last number of months, I don't know exactly when it happened because I don't stay on top of everything. Our link to my TV show, Into the Vortex, went bad. Yeah, so all of the links. So we are going the correct links, or a link that works, I should say. It's not the original link, is up and posted, but the probably 100 shows that we've done over the last, 4 or 5 months, all have a bad link in it. And that includes all of my social media profiles and everything that it bummed me out, but we've got it fixed. And so there you go. Check out Into the Vortex with the good link that is below. And both seasons are up, or the first 2 seasons, I should say. And we're getting ready to start season 3. Okay, so check out. Wow, what is wrong with my throat all of a sudden? See, that's the problem. I want to bring Damon in. That's the problem with working at an event as large as the Conscious Life Expo and talking and introducing and hosting and doing everything that I did for 4 straight days. I'm paid to speak. Nobody cares what I look like. No. They care about my pipes. And I do, man. I overuse them. And it's just like right now, I guess I need to make sure I get through the show. So, Jimmy, relax. Tonight, Dr. Damon Abraham will discuss his groundbreaking research in the field of parapsychology. We're going to be focusing on the fascinating realm where tech meets Psi. Now, there's a lot of work that's going on here. He's a researcher in affective science and parapsychology and is the principal research scientist at Entangled, which is a conscious-based mobile app exploring the boundaries between mind and reality. His research intersects a broad range of topics, including emotion and mental representation, non-local consciousness. We're going to get into that tonight. You know, all that out-of-body stuff. And non-local perception. What is that? Well, you know, remote viewing. We're going to get into that too as well. And non-local influences. Now, before we get all technical and complicated, I'm not the big brain here. Damon is. So I would like to welcome for the first time to Fade to Black. There he is. Dr. Damon Abraham, PhD. Damon, good evening and welcome to the show. But before we get started, you get the first time guest disclaimer, which is a weird disclaimer because I've had all of your friends on the show. So it's like you're last in line, but you finally made it. Damon, here's the disclaimer. It's just you and I sitting on my couch having a conversation as friends. And where that conversation starts, it starts. Where it ends, but we're going to end as friends. And you have to accept.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Man, you're easy. You're easy for a smart guy.
I've never been introduced to anything in my life as the big brain. So let's hopefully I can fill those big shoes that go with that big brain. But pleasure to be on.
Well, you know, actually, we're starting at a pretty good. I like that comment, and I'll tell you why. When you've got a bunch of friends that are, you know, your team, I should say. I assume you're all friends, and that's a lot of brain power, you know, applied to this. But be honest, is there a competition?
I find it in this little sub niche to be very collaborative on the whole. And maybe there is a competition. I'm not part of it. I really, you know, I have a disposition of wanting to push the work forward and to help out wherever I can. You know, it's too small of a piece of pie for all of us to be fighting over. I think the perspective I take is we need to grow that pie, you know, and expand this work out. So at least in my perspective, the competitive angle doesn't get you very far, you know.
Really, you know what? I'm not buying what you're selling right now. and let me ask you this: you guys hang out, you guys work together, and what are those conversations like? Do you guys talk about food and baking pies, or are you talking about locality, non-locality? And forks, right? You know, what do you guys talk about when you get together?
You know, I think the big topics of interest are all these amazing ideas that everybody has and the lack of funding or resources to actually bring them to life. It would be the big conversations, I think, that are often happening at these types of gatherings.
Isn't that always the issue? And it doesn't matter if it's archaeology or anthropology or physics, but the funding environment to move things forward is competitive. That's tough, isn't it?
That is tough. It is tough, and there's just so few resources that are, you know, that are viable resources. You know, there's a reliance on, you know, private donors. You know, a lot of scientific organizations that are in this space are constantly vying for memberships, and I think a lot of times they share memberships. You know, the members that will be, you know, across different organizations. So, you know, you're kind of competing in that way as well. There's just far fewer funding opportunities than if you were in a, you know, more of a traditional field. So that's definitely it's a challenge. It's a challenge.
When you let's get a few basics out of the way, because we're going to be talking about some pretty deep subjects tonight, and at some point, even for the audience, they're going to back up and go, "Wait, what? This is going over my head. I don't understand what they're talking about." So let's get some foundations going here and definitions and so forth. I want to start with you personally. When you're on your track, were you not running? When you're on your track, were you focused? Was it math, physics, philosophy? And where is your foundation?
Yeah, it was psychology, really, is where I kind of got started. And as an undergrad, I studied psychology, but I also kind of fancied myself to be an artist. And in particular, I was very interested in film. And I was interested in that intersection of like the psychology of media. So as an undergrad, I mean, I was very fascinated on things like even the whole visual illusion of film, right? It's 12 to 24 frames per second, 30 in video. And these are just still images that if you cycle them at a certain rate, that we perceive them as motion, as continuous motion. But if you slow it down too much, it's like Christmas lights. If they were just blinking one at a time, you lose that motion effect. It just looks like one light goes on and the next one comes off. You know what I mean? And so I was really interested in some of this kind of intersection of like perception and how film itself is really an interesting medium because it evokes these perspectives that we don't normally take, but we adopt very readily. For example, if you watch a McDonald's commercial, there's going to be something around 60 to 65 different shots in a 1 minute bit, so it's just like every second is a new perspective, a new frame. And that's not how we go through life, right? We don't adopt multiple vantage points throughout the day. We're usually this continuous first person perspective through the world. And yet we don't even question that reality if, sometimes you're looking at the person in the film and sometimes you are looking through the person's eyes. Sometimes you're above them, So I thought this really, really fascinating as an undergrad and wanted to study film directly, but took some time off. I went into, you have your degree and then you have like life and what really, there wasn't psychology of film career tracks that I was available for. So I ended up in sales actually, and not willingly, but it was a job. And I was hacking Gateway computers. Do you remember Gateway? And it was really interesting to me that all of the techniques of the sales process were straight out of a psychology textbook. You're kind of seeing social psychology applied. Things like priming. When the moment you answer the phone, I would say thank you for calling Gateway Computers. My name is Damon. How can I help you today? Already we're introducing that concept today, right? Because even though you thought you were calling to buy your, daughter a computer in 3 months when she goes to college, you're going to be issuing me that credit card at the end of this call. That makes sense? And, I did not like that manipulative aspect of it, but it was really fascinating to see all of these techniques that you read about in an abstract way in a textbook, to see how they were directly applied to influence other people's behavior. And I was just so fascinated by that. And I ended up, finding that, I kind of wanted to pursue psychology, but at the same time, my wife and I moved to New York. I had this esoteric interest my whole life, not through experiences, but just through pure fascination, reading about and hearing about like out of body experiences and wondering if that was possible. And I found myself at a nonprofit group in New York City that was teaching courses on how to have an OBE, how to produce it. And I started having my own experiences. And at the same time, I was applying to graduate programs. And that really kind of led me on this path of like, well, I want to study these phenomena with a scientific lens. I want to still have my own experiences, but I also want to be able to have the right tools and methodology, the right grounding, really, to be able to talk about these from a research perspective, to really connect with serious science in the field. So it's not just like, oh, put your foil hat on and go have an OBE or astral projection or whatever you want to call it. You know what I mean? And that's really what set me on that path. So while my academic studies have remained pretty well centered in mainstream psychology. Throughout that time, I've been building my network and kind of playing midnight parapsychologist, if you will, and exploring these more esoteric pursuits concurrently. And now these things are starting to intersect, which has been great.
So, let's go with consciousness first.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, and it's the same question, but I'm going to ask it two different ways. Okay, you're going to answer it once, but there's two. Which is consciousness of the physical or non-physical? But before you answer, when you were taking your psych classes in college, what were they teaching you? My question after you answer is going to be, how did you find that out? Because you're going to give me one answer or the other. So is consciousness of the physical and non-physical, and what did they teach you in your psych classes about that?
Yeah. Well, I don't think anybody really knows. But to me, the model of reality works and accounts for more phenomena if we think of consciousness as being that something that maybe supersedes matter, that it's more fundamental. Whereas not just in the field of psychology, but I think mainstream science to date still takes this material reductionist bend where they might see that this, physical reality is like ground truth, and that consciousness is a product of it, or what they call an epiphenomena. So we say it's like an epiphenomena of brain activity. We don't know how we get there, but we know if we have all these neurons lumped together in sophisticated enough networks, at some point consciousness emerges out of that. And I think for a number of reasons, this becomes a very problematic view. One is this issue of like a demarcation problem. So at what point of sophisticated like network connectivity can we say that someone or something is conscious or not? And so this is kind of a question like, well, to what other organisms or species do we attribute consciousness to? Like, we take for granted that our pets have some level of consciousness, but that wasn't always the case. There was early like torturous experiments, I think even by like Descartes and others, like just like, oh, this is just like the screaming reflex. This is, we can dissect them while they're alive without anesthesia and it's fine because they don't have feelings, like they're like automata, right? So problematic. Like we don't know, A, we don't know what consciousness is, and B, we don't, in having a lack of a definitive quality or a way to kind of parameterize it, we don't know where to attribute it and where not. So we're still stuck with this problem of I only know consciousness through my own experience of it, which is kind of that Descartes I think, therefore I am kind of perspective, right? And in my experience, my direct experience, having had OBEs, I've seen my own consciousness seem to operate beyond just the physical. And so that makes me tend to believe that the consciousness is some fundamental thing. And matter is some phenomena of it, perhaps, which is more of an idealist perspective, I guess, a metaphysical idealist perspective. And there's still, infinite numbers of questions. So at what point is consciousness individuated then? Like, so if we say like, okay, if it's not physical, then, what's the container that says this is my consciousness and this is your consciousness, and how do these things keep themselves separate? And these are all really difficult questions. Yeah.
And how what was the curriculum behind it?
Oh yes, I'm sorry, the fault. I mean, definitely the mainstream psychological field is taking more of a material approach, and so my studies really started in more of a neuroscience type program. I worked in a lab at Columbia University in New York. I was kind of working as a research assistant and lab manager, doing fMRI work, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging for those that don't know. So MRI is like the structure of the brain, and functional is tracing the movement of hemoglobin. So it's basically a proxy of the oxygen consumption of the brain. And so from that, you can derive what regions of the brain are activated during certain types of mental activity. Okay. So yeah, there was a lot of grounding in neuroscience. I took a lot of courses in neuroscience. I started in a cognitive neuroscience program before transferring to the University of Denver. And yeah, I think it's pretty ubiquitous. It's the idea is the brain is where consciousness comes from. And if you lesion the brain, you'll have essentially a lesion in consciousness to some extent. You'll have atrophy in your ability to kind of behavioral or cognitive issues that come from that. And everything's the brain. Everything's about the brain. And that's a pretty common, that's not a controversial stance to take in psychology right now. To what extent this, is maybe a residual of like hard behaviorism from the 70s. And you think of like the behaviorism, and then you had like kind of this cognitive revolution, but in conjunction with the cognitive revolution was also the revolution of like computer tech, even like getting to like the personal computer. So a lot of our metaphors that we use are kind of like deployed in both cognitive psychology as well as you think about like computer hardware, like long-term and short-term memory, and all of these kind of procedural definitions that are almost kind of treating the brain as some kind of biological computer. And maybe it's a useful metaphor in some respects, but I think that kind of makes us kind of think about things in a way that may not be actually correct.
What is locality?
Well, I think maybe the way you mean this question is when we think of, if the consciousness is a product of brain activity, if it's caused by brain activity, then our consciousness would then be localized to the position of the body, essentially.
And non-locality?
Yeah, non-locality is a perspective that, well, so some people take a stance that the brain is more like a receiver, transducer of consciousness. You can so almost liken it to a radio or a television set. That like you don't watch an episode of Seinfeld and then take your TV apart to try to figure out which wire goes to Kramer and which one goes to Seinfeld, right? Like, so we intuitively realize that the TV is the receiver and transmitter; it's not the source. And so that kind of model people apply to like the idea of non-local consciousness, that we as a body are just kind of like a specially tuned apparatus that's receiving and transmitting our consciousness. So I'm here enacting and embodied through this body, but that my consciousness self is not necessarily strictly contained within it. Does that make sense, or is that a little bit too much of a word salad?
No. Because we're going to be using all of these words tonight, and so when you are stringing a sentence along and popping all of these in, we will have hopefully a foundation and understanding things. What is the difference between psychology and parapsychology?
Well, quite a lot. I think psychology is often thought of as like the study of behavior, but there's many different offshoots of that are study of like behavior through the brain, or biological psychology. There's cultural psychology. We think of parapsychology is certainly has components of this kind of inner workings of the mind, but often is applied to more anomalous types of activity. So things like, you brought up remote or non-locality. So you can think of like non-local perception being things like remote viewing, or perceiving information not through the physical senses. Things like the whole ESP, right? Like extrasensory perception is a kind of a class of non-local perception. It's beyond the physical senses. And then you have the idea of non-local action, like the question of whether people can have an influence that's not mediated through the body, right? So, I can pick up my glass, and we're can easily see the consequence of my physical action on that object. But if I were to sit with let's say a pinwheel and try to spin it with my mind and get it moving, now we have this kind of PK effect, and there's no really clear mechanism by which that effect is mediated. And so, so parapsychology is kind of around these like anomalous activities that are still connected to the person and still connected to the mind, but with not necessarily a discernible mechanism of action, which makes it really difficult to study.
And we'll be talking about PK. So let's go ahead and drop that in now. What's the definition for you?
So broadly speaking, it's psychokinesis, which is that very, very idea of non-local action. So non-physically mediated action. There are researchers that like to kind of break this down into classes of like macro PK, which would be like the movement of physical objects, like dense physical objects, versus micro PK, which could be more of a movement of information, so to speak. So like, I know Dean Radin's done a lot of work with like having people try to bias the movement of, I believe, photons. Trying to like essentially almost like doing a double slit, but you're trying to bias it one way or another using intention. So that'd be kind of like a quantum effect. There's, of course, the long history of research with random event generators, which, for the audience that may not know, is kind of likened to a electronic coin flipper, in which any bit that's produced by the reg, which random event generator is reg, right? Any bit that's produced cannot be predicted by the bits that came before it. So it's a truly random event. And you'll have participants come in the lab and sit down with a device that's producing these, and to try to use intention to bias the output to be more ones or more zeros, which would be like, trying to bias the coin toss to be more heads or tails. This is often thought of as like a micro PK effect, because it's really at seemingly at the level of the information. It's not like you're physically moving something. Whether or not these are actually so neatly carved at the joints that these are actually discrete phenomena, I think is up for debate. But, functionally, we kind of tend to class them such.
Well, when you see large numbers, no longer groups of numbers, I should say, no longer 50-50, right? Over a long span of time. And you do see the influence from when somebody is going, right? Or whatever. Yeah. And you see that, and they are affecting change. Definitely, as Radin puts it, at the quantum level, that's where that is happening, right? Whether it's in the electrical systems involved, whether it's down to the component level of the circuitry, or if it's something else more magical out into the air, and it's something else is going on. But if the output is changed even a little bit, right, then there is something going on that we can't measure or quantify, can we?
Well, we can't measure or quantify the mechanism, but we have like the intention of the person or the agent, and then we can measure the results, right?
Yeah,
so
you have the data. Yeah, you have the data. I get that, but we don't know what is happening in the middle.
No. And I have some perhaps unpopular opinions about this, in my little sub niche, but I think we do ourselves a disservice in a way, trying to hunt down those mechanisms too much. And let me try to unpack that a little bit. We categorize all these different phenomenology as if they were distinct, discrete processes, right? Like you have remote viewing versus PK versus, whatever the phenomena may be. And while they seem to kind of cluster together, that there's commonalities. You talk to a lot of advanced remote viewers, and they may have a little bit of like an out of body. Like I talked to a viewer the other day that was working on a missing persons case, and she found herself in the trunk of the car that the missing person was being transported in. And she had a lot of direct hits. I mean, this was actually actionable information she was able to glean from this experience. But that sounds a lot to me like an OBE. But then it's displaced in time because it was in the past. So like what's going on here? Like the phenomenology of a remote viewing is like you're usually kind of still contained in your present person state where you are, and you're perceiving information that's out there and you're transcribing it. But this sounded to me much more like an experiencing of being there, right? And so I think if you look at how psi happens in the lab, or what this whole constellation of effects, how it happens in the lab versus how it actually happens in reality, when people have these experiences, there's a lot of blending that goes on. And I don't think that these phenomena are really traceable back to a specific mechanism. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think we're chasing the wrong tail. Let's say the example I give is like I think it's called cross-modal processing, I believe. So here's the idea. If I asked you to write your name down, and assuming you're right-hand dominant, put a pen in your right hand, no problem, you write it down, okay? But then let's say I duct taped your hand shut. Well, you could put the pen in your left hand and presumably still approximate your name. And if that didn't work, you could put it in your teeth or put it in your toes. You could even like clasp your elbows together if you had to, right? So that motor program is somewhat independent of the mechanism by which it transpires. And the most important thing is the meaning. You're trying to convey your name. That's so that you have this kind of like the level of why, or where the information really is at this why. And here we are as scientists looking at all these different hows and trying to carve reality up by all these different hows. I think that's a bad approach. And I think that approach is really comes about because we are so conditioned to being in this physical reality and seeing the world through these kind of like kind of individuated forms. We think of things as being discrete, but all of these phenomena are telling us that there's this hyper connectivity in reality of phenomena and of consciousness. And so to me, the idea of studying a phenomena by mechanism is kind of like going back to the pen. It's like trying to examine the ink of the pen and trying to understand what the name means that you just wrote down, right? So we get really caught up in these low-level analyses and trying to define phenomena. Is it precognition? Is it PK? I mean, who knows? And we miss sometimes the bigger picture. And this is my personal view. I know a lot of parapsychologists are very much, they have their pet theories. So, that's just my approach to it. I'm much more interested in the bigger why than all of these kind of like mechanistic approaches.
Well, but we all want to know the how. I mean, this conversation, right, is great. I love it. But you know what everybody's thinking? Okay, all right, but how? Right? It always does come back to that. There was Sean Carroll, right, the great physicist and stuff. Sometimes Sean is pretty narrow-minded, as much as I appreciate his work. But he made a comment one time that offended me so greatly, I almost never read or listened to him ever again. And this is what he said. He's answering questions, right? He's doing an AMA. And the question came up, and it often does. We all do it. What is consciousness? And his answer was this: I don't care. He goes, I don't have time to think about something that I can't touch.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have time. So, and he doesn't even realize that he's speaking the words And that phenomenon, that miracle, right? That thing, he doesn't ponder about it. And it just offended me. Just the very notion that you are able to do that. And now you brought up, okay, let's tie that into this. When I had this thought the other night, knowing I was having you on the show, I don't know where this came from, but I had this thought. We've all heard about the experiments of animal, with the dot on his head, looks at himself in the mirror, and does he recognize himself and so forth. Okay, all right. But I took that idea one step further. I had Riz Verk on the show the other day. I hung out with him this weekend, and he's a big AR, AI guy, simulation theory, his new book and stuff. Anyway, very smart guy, teaches at MIT. But he did a demo of the new Apple, whatever you want to call them, right? Goggles.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, what would a chimpanzee see? Right? Now, stop and think about that concept for a second, because we can be immersed and accept a new 3D environment and enjoy it and explore it and think about it. But what would that do to a chimpanzee's mind, who is sentient? We know that, right? Okay, we know this. What would happen if you just check? Because they are used to this environment of nature. What would happen to a chimp if you put that on and now he's in the world of Tron?
I can't even speculate on that. I mean, that's a really interesting question. I think it's interesting enough just to see how we deal with that, right?
Right.
And one thing I've thought about, I haven't really bought into the simulation theory in its full glory, but I do think that there's many different layers of reality that are possible with our experience. And my question is, we get, you start to become accustomed to the idea of, you put on this VR and it's a very convincing, they call it the presence or whatever, the sense of presence, that you really are transported to that environment and your senses are telling you that you're there. And it doesn't feel like an illusion. It feels like a reality. But then we take the goggles off and we're back to this reality. And if we start to become accustomed to doing that, and we do this routinely, at some point, do we start to question, well, is this reality, or is there another set of goggles I need to take off?
Well,
that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, and so is there, talking about the idea of seeing something in an RV setting in the past? It doesn't make any sense. Well, it does. It makes perfect sense. But where RV is supposed to be, non-local in the now, right? You're not predicting the future. You're not pre-cogging or post-cogging, right? Or anything like that. It's in the now. So could it be, is there like a theory of everything when it comes to this? Could it just be one simple thing in the how that is allowing all of this to happen? Something as basic as maybe entanglement, right? There's something else, very simple, but it's the same thing affecting all of the phenomena.
Yeah, I think probably one of the more productive theories that I've seen lately is with Daniel Sheehan. He's at the University of San Diego, and not UCSD, but University of San Diego. And he's doing a lot of work. He's a physicist working in time as well as, and he collaborates with Dr. Julia Mossbridge as well on this idea of time. And I'll butcher his model because I'm not a physicist, but the idea is essentially that you have this kind of forward causal process, which is the past leading to the present, but that there's this kind of equal retrocausal process of the future affecting the now as well. And it's like the present moment is almost created by these kind of intersecting causal waves, essentially. And he'll probably get angry if he hears me say that. It's like, well, that's not at all, but that's my rough interpretation of it. And so there is no real reason to think that, you know, the remote viewing has to be isolated to the now, that there is this kind of atemporal aspect of it, that people do perceive the future and they do perceive the past. And something I've observed as well in talking to numerous people, and I've had my own experiences, and perhaps you have as well, is like even like an intense dream sometimes can have a subjective time that's quite a long, very detailed dream, but only occurs within a couple of moments, a couple of minutes. You know, you hit the snooze button on your alarm and it goes off 10 minutes later, and yet you had what felt like an hour of life experience away. And a lot of out-of-body experiences have this same kind of phenomena where there's just a mismatch in time, where you have a lot more experience than what chronologically seems to happen here. And I've talked to several near-death experiencers that had a sense of no time, that there was no time in the environment that they were in, or at least it didn't work the same way that it does here, that there was some kind of reality that time doesn't operate the way that we kind of construct it here. In fact, one of my good friends, Nancy Rhines, she's spoken at many conferences. She's been on some of the national news circuits, etc. She had been run over by a woman in a pickup truck while she was on her bike and just dragged and had this just grueling experience. But during her NDE, she was working with what she describes as like spirit guides, etc. And she had what she described as months. She said there was no time, but like experience-wise, it was like months of conscious experience. And she was only flatlined for a number of minutes, short number of minutes. So to me, just like matter, time is it's a construct, it's functional, it certainly is how this reality works, but whether or not it's a property of like the base reality, I don't think that it necessarily is constrained in such a way. Right?
It doesn't really. It's kind of, if we talk about relativity, and Einstein and what he was trying to, well, and did, I think it's a pretty solid foundation today. Few inconsistencies, and everybody's been trying to prove them wrong forever and have failed. But relativity is just that, right? Everything is relative to the view of one, right? So how is that's relativity, and that is what you're speaking to here, because when he talks about space and space time and how time can be altered, and how people perceive it. I hate talking about dreams. Hate is a strong word, but I hate hearing about people's dreams. I don't want to hear the story, and I don't like telling my dreams. Okay, so, but 5 years ago, rough number, I had this dream that I wrote a book. Okay, in the dream, and in the dream, I start on page 1. and right, and I finish it, whatever, it's 500 pages. And then I get to the end, all of it's there. Every page, every thought, everything, it's all in the dream. And I get to the end, right? And then I wake up. And I thought to myself, how is it possible to fully review 30 days of work, right? Typing the book, having all of that in the span of 6 hours. That doesn't make any sense, but that's the way I dreamed it. Every page, everything. And I was so confused with that, Damon. I mean, it just that concept right there, right? Is it what Einstein is talking about? Am I in my dream state or anybody's dream state? Am I actually in another reality? And I'm experiencing time different there. And then I come back into my body, 6 hours have passed. But over there, 30 days passed. Now, is that crazy talk? Because that's what I feel happened.
I mean, that seems exactly in line with what I was saying. And I mean, I hear you, and my training does not allow me to speak to physics. I'm way out of my league when it comes to that. And I'm not one to deny physical reality or how things work. There's certainly a lot of evidence that physical processes work the way they work, and there's temporal components to that as well. But I'm also of the mind that consciousness is not, again, a product of physical reality. And I don't think that it's necessarily constrained. It's certainly filtered in a way, right? And it is constrained, or at least partially constrained, right? My consciousness is not floating up at that bridge there and then back to my body. At least that's not my perspective. I feel embodied in here. But yet I've had many other personal experiences, and a lot of the data in the field of parapsychology seem to suggest that there is this aspects of consciousness that seem to violate our understandings of how physical reality works, including the limitation of the speed of light. People have what they call projections, which maybe they perceive themselves as being across the galaxy and back, in much faster than light speed of locating. Now, of course, you can argue that you can't verify, that's a subjective, that's not an objective phenomena. But there are a number of objective occurrences that they call like veridical experiences, or evidence that people have been able to obtain, where they perceive themselves as operating out of the body, not remote viewing, but actually perceive themselves as there, apprehend information, and come back in a time that just seems to violate any physical law that we would have. So while I don't deny physical reality, I don't think that it's base reality. I think that something involving consciousness is base reality, and so it's not necessarily constrained by physical reality entirely. This is exactly the problem I take with the simulation arguments as well. And I'm not well read in that, so again, I'm speaking out of my field. But we people have come up with very sophisticated mathematical and Bayesian models about the simulation hypothesis and why it's likely true, et cetera. But there's this assumption that seems to be made that the simulation runs, so you have the simulating entity, runs based on the physics of our physical reality. So that to me is like, if I'm playing, let's say, Donkey Kong and Mario, you have the game from the 80s, and Mario achieves like self-awareness and consciousness and starts questioning his reality, and then start to think like, hey, maybe this is a simulation. Maybe this isn't base reality. There's got to be another reality where people can jump, 8 feet tall over barrels. And, like you're trying to define the physics of this reality based on the physics of the game. I think that's a mistake. And so while I think there's some version of the simulation hypothesis might be true, but I think it's more like a simulation of consciousness where matter or physical reality are parameters that are essentially almost like a consensus construction that we operate in. We're bound to some extent, but that's not base reality. My belief is that base reality is rooted in consciousness, not the other way around. Again,
Well,
this is hard to verify. This is not really a scientific question. This is more of a personal philosophy question, but it definitely congrues with my experiences.
yeah, but right now on another planet in Andromeda, some kid walked into another alien's bedroom and goes, "What are you doing?" He goes, "Man, check this out. My character, Damon Abraham, is on. He's about to talk about us. Watch this." Right? You don't know, right?
Right.
And
Right.
when you talk about VR, now I believe that we are who we are. Okay, I'm not a big. I'd love to think about the simulation hypothesis. I think it's a fascinating subject, but the other part of it is it doesn't change anything, right? It simply does not. And if we are all in a simulation, I still have to put gas in my car, right? That doesn't change anything. But the other part is what happens when we are in a simulation inside of a simulation, right? Which is what we are doing with gaming and social media and all of that. And then what if we are in the simulation playing a game, and then in that game we go into a simulation? That's part of the game, right? Now that's going multiple layers, dreaming in a simulation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wait, what if I'm dreaming about a simulation in the simulation? That's the part where it starts to unravel for me, and I think that this is our base reality, and I'm okay with that. But the idea behind it, we're not far away. We're not.
No. Yeah.
You played video games, right?
Yeah. There's a episode of Rick and Morty where they go to some cosmic arcade and they play the game Roy, and you kind of put on a VR helmet, and then you're some kid that's playing football, and you get on the high school football team and you win the big game, and then you go work at your father's carpet company. All this whole life, and then they take the helmet off and I didn't even know who you are anymore. Like you totally buy into that. I think that episode is so hilarious because it kind of captures exactly what we're talking about, that we seem to accept certain things about our reality based on our perspectives, and it could very well be that changes rapidly once we take off our, let's say, our virtual helmets. But a question that interests me is how much of this, because I'm in the business of researching anomalies, and anomalies are only anomalies by virtue that they seem to not work in accordance with our physics as we understand it, right? So any consciousness effect of non-local perception or non-local action seems to violate what we think we know about physical reality. And so my good friend Adam Curry and I often like to talk about this idea of consensus reality. It's like, to what extent is, like, there's these hard laws in physics, but maybe there's certain things that are almost like a consciousness contract that we go into, that we allow things to work the way they will. And you see this historically. If a culture, let's say the shaman, wants to do something that reality doesn't allow them to do, they'll do a ritual. Maybe the tribe will do a ritual. They'll get into an altered state, and suddenly the healing happens, or suddenly the vision happens. You have the talismanic magics, right? It's not like you just sit down and start carving your symbols into wood. No, you got to do the whole ceremony and ritual, and then the magic works. The talisman has its effect, right? And so there's certain, like, windows we give ourselves to violate consensus reality and allow these things. We've almost, like, now we've created a new contract, like we're a clause in the contract, like we've done a little ritual. Now reality can work a little bit differently for this particular task or this specific context. So my experience with this, aside from dabbling in some of these things directly, I've done a couple of trips to Indonesia and studied martial arts there with a group that does both like kind of the physical and the internal. A lot of meditation, breathing, and a lot of ceremony, and a lot of, for lack of a better word, magic. And I've witnessed so many supernatural type of phenomena that are taken culturally to be quite common and quite normal. It's
Like
just like
what?
not a big thing.
Like what?
Like orbs and like my friend was there. There's a news story like, oh, a woman's got barbed wire growing out of her stomach because of a curse. It was just like on TV, like, here's Tom with the weather, and a lot of things with like on the martial side would be like breaking steel files. I've seen a kid like roll up a piece of newspaper and chop a steel file like it was a little twig. You can do the opposite of that, like taking a light bulb and charging the light bulb with chi and bouncing it on the hard surface. It'll literally bounce. And I've been able to do certain stuff in that area, not quite adeptly as some of my colleagues, but my point is it's such much more common there. And so I wonder if there's that kind of almost like a different consensus reality bubble. And my point in saying this is that we have this kind of agreed upon way that physical reality works, but then we know that we can have a more malleable in virtual space. So let's say we create a virtual world that we're used to flying and we're used to being able to manipulate objects at a distance or do these types of things, right? So we do kind of like virtual magic in our virtual reality world, but we're conditioning our subconscious that these things are possible. So I'm wondering if those types of things might start to have a carryover influence when the helmets are off and we're in this reality, because we're starting to kind of like trick our subconscious. We're kind of getting this new consensus contract about what's possible, because you start having a lot of experiences of what's possible and it starts to try to change your boundaries of where that limit goes. Does that make sense?
It does.
Now, I don't know if that's going to happen that way or not, but that's an interesting prediction. If we can think of like, not that physical reality are hard laws, but they're just highly regular. They're highly regularized probabilities. That when we start to collectively realize that we can slightly bias, or maybe even more than slightly bias, those probabilities, that we might actually see shifts in the way physical reality works. Maybe certain things that we thought were laws are actually more like strongly worded guidelines.
Well, you wouldn't be, now I'm talking about at the quantum level where this action, it has to start somewhere, right? So it's going to start, you're not affecting an atom. That's how you're not affecting a particle. In order to see the effect, whatever it may be, it doesn't matter what the phenomena is, but in order to see the effect, ultimately you are interacting with trillions upon trillions to the 10th power trillions of atoms, right? In order for us to see some change in the physical world. I don't know how many atoms are in a cell, but it's a buttload, right? So if you are doing that, then you're not affecting a particle, you're affecting trillions upon trillions upon trillions, right? Is that the right thought process?
Yeah, I think that though, like, there's certainly hierarchies or information hierarchies. So when you think about things like mechanistically, let's go back to the writing your name on a piece of paper example, right? You have the intention and you have the information and you've got a lot of conditioning that's trained the motor program to grasp the pen and do what it needs to do. But you're not privy to the underlying machinations of the brain or the neural circuitry or the motor circuitry that's actualizing that behavior, right? It's hierarchical. It's very top down.
Right. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me.
It's all happening under the head of you have your, when I say consciousness in this term, I mean you're like floating bubble of awareness versus all of this processing that's happening in more of a subconscious layer. So my point in saying that is trying to influence reality at the particle level is not really how it goes down. It's more, a bias at a much higher level of operating, and that can have a cascading effect. You're kind of more of a top down why drive and not worrying so much about the how. If that makes sense.
So to move something, right? Okay, here's a USB drive, right? And I want to see this move on my desk. You're looking at the totality of that. You're looking at the drive. You're not looking at and that's what I'm referring to, right? So I get that. I know that I'm looking at the drive, but you're affecting everything that is here. It's not just the drive as a whole. And the reason why I bring that up is that again, I know physics isn't in your wheelhouse. Well, it is partially, has to be. But when physicists try to explain to us what entanglement is and how crazy it is, right? Two particles on the opposite sides of the universe, right? Affecting each other in real time, changing the spin of a particle on the opposite sides of the universe. That messes with all of the laws. Speed of light, that's out the window, right? Because it's the speed of now, which is a lot faster than the speed of light. So, but that's one particle and one particle. So the entanglement of these particles has to be one-on-one with everything that is here. And that's my point. And that's so if physicists want to say entanglement is real, then they have to accept parapsychology or PK or remote viewing or consciousness being non-physical. I would think you can't have it both ways.
Yeah, you'd think. We're very good at staying narrow in our questioning sometimes. So, there's like you said, the physicist that doesn't find consciousness interesting. So I think that's a really, really interesting question. And I mean, of course, a lot of people it's tempting to want to use quantum mechanics as some model for understanding consciousness. Other people really caution against that. It's like you're just taking one super complicated thing and trying to use it as then all complicated things must be related somehow. I don't really know where I fall on that, but it does seem, with the experiments that like Dean Radin's done with the biasing of the quantum tunneling and a lot of the stuff when I see like PK effects, it does seem to be that it might be more like you're a slight bias to the probability space, for lack of a better word, you're kind of collapsing the wave function in a sense. So, but again, I don't know if that's really what's going on, but it seems plausible to me.
If you bring in the probability side of it as an answer, is certainly from a physics point of view, I think that's a cop-out. Everything is probable and everything will happen eventually. So let's chalk it up to that. No, right. There's something else actually ultimately going on here. We're going to take a break right here to set up for what we're going to talk about when we come back. Give me an idea of when you need tech to work on an idea in parapsychology. What kind of tech are we talking about?
Well, the project I've been working on most recently is creating a. Do you want to talk about this now or after the break? I'm sorry.
No, set it up and we'll talk about it after the break.
Okay, yeah. So I've been working on a pretty large undertaking to create a stimulus database that would be used for both traditional psychology as well as parapsychology experiments. So these are image stimuli, photographs, for lack of a better word. and using, in this case, I'm using AI to try to help understand the semantic information contained in these images, and some of the visual information composition of these images, as well as we're getting a bunch of human ratings, subjective ratings on many psychological dimensions of these images, to then better try to understand some of the kind of psychological mechanisms behind even remote viewing. So the bane of remote viewers is a phenomenon called displacement, wherein you may have a target and a decoy image, and you're supposed to be viewing the target, and you get a really strong hit on the decoy, and so it fails the statistical test. It looks like your experiment didn't work, but it also is showing you as the participant that you clearly had remote viewing. It just didn't work out the way you wanted it to, or the way you planned it to. And so we're trying to understand a little bit more of that process, as well as I think there's a lot of really interesting opportunities with the generative side of things. So using models to create information based on like randomness and hopefully consciousness driven types of mechanisms to create new images, new text, etc.
Fascinating. Let's take our break right here. Our guest tonight, Dr. Damon Abraham. We are talking about tech meets psi, parapsychology. We'll be right back after this short break. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to get your alerts and access to over 2,000 videos. Click that subscribe button right now.
My job is not to preach. My job is to take you on this journey.
In a state of passion, nothing negative can happen.
That it's the moons of those planets that would have life.
Sometimes I see, these energies also in your field.
It is our passion and our pleasure.
Go to jimmychurchradio.com and get the Fade to Black official podcast. 2,000 episodes, all of them commercial free for just $2 a month. This is Jimmy Church. Please visit and explore Egypt this October 3rd through the 14th, 2024 with Billy, Elizabeth, myself, and very special guest, Matt LaCroix. It's simple to do. Just go to forbiddenknowledge.com and click on upcoming tours, or click on the link below. We'll see you there. Watch Into the Vortex on Gaia TV. It's Fade to Black for the screen. Simple to do. Go to Gaia.com, search Jimmy Church, or click on the link below. Follow Fade to Black on Twitter at JChurchRadio. Get all of the show updates every single day. It's now called X, but who cares? How you doing? Jimmy Church here. Special announcement. Get your Fade to Black t-shirts. That's right. Help support the show. Help support everything that we do over here. We've got 2 t-shirts. We've got 2 ways to get them. And right now, if you get a Game Changer membership for a limited time, you will get Fade to Black blend coffee with your Game Changer membership. That's right. We have 2 t-shirts. We have the original, the classic Fade to Black t-shirt. You know you want one. Post a picture. Send it to us. We'll put it in our Fade to Black gallery. And we've got the new official Fade to Black t-shirt drawn by Michael Oming. 2 t-shirts, 2 ways to get them. Get yours today. Everything is in stock. Everything gets autographed. Everything includes shipping. And you're going to get a tracking number. And with a Game Changer membership, you get an email to me. You get unlimited commercial-free downloads of the show. Those are uploaded every single night after the show to the website. So don't delay. Get your Fade to Black t-shirt today. Go Backley Tappy. Go to jimmychurchradio.com and become a Fadernaut. Get a membership. That's right. Everything is commercial free. You have access to downloads, and you get to call yourself a Fadernaut. River Moon Coffee, makers of the Fade to Black blend. Truly the best coffee on planet Earth. Just visit rivermoonwellness.com or their Amazon store. It's all simple to do. You can check out the Fade to Black blend, the Game Changer blend, or any of their Black Moon Wellness products. It's the only coffee I drink. It is the best, and it's Doc. Again, rivermoonwellness.com. All right. Welcome back, Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Tonight, our guest, Dr. Damon Abraham. We're talking about tech meets psi, parapsychology, and his research into that. And to keep things moving forward here. Okay, so you're using images to achieve measurement and results. Explain the process.
Yeah, so oftentimes, let's just take remote viewing as a narrow case for use of images. We utilize images as target pools. So, instead of having a viewer view a place or a specific coordinate, you can have the target just be an image. And the judging is based on the degree of match between the transcript that the viewer provides and the contents of the image. I was at a very fascinating talk, I think like 2017, 2018, I think. Dale Graff, I don't know if you know Dale, very preeminent researcher in this field. He's done a lot of work with dream psi, but in this case, it was a dream psi version of, it's kind of like a remote viewing task, but in their task, the participant they were tasked with dreaming the cover of the newspaper 6 days into the future, I think was what it was. And this was several years ago before, it wasn't like an online periodical. It was actually a physical paper. So there's no way anyone knows, because it's an event that hasn't even happened yet. And you're trying to dream like what this specific page with the cover image will be. And seeing the transcripts, the match between these kind of dream transcripts and the images was just so fascinating, because in one case it was like an ambulance in a car crash, and so you could see the scene and the description in the newspaper, and then the perspective that the person took It's kind of like this overview, looking down on an ambulance and the people, and et cetera. I think some cars. It was a brilliant hit. Very, very good demonstration. The transcript was produced days before the event even happened. Fascinating. But what really struck me in hearing this talk and seeing these examples is that sometimes we're like drawn into the scene. Sometimes we're kind of encouraged to take maybe a third person perspective. And this relates a little bit to my work in psychology as well. I'm really fascinated at why does some contents or some images maybe evoke one perspective over another. And it really kind of took me down this rabbit hole. It's like it's not enough to understand the contents of the image. There's this whole process of how the person interacts with that psychologically that can determine, how they're engaging with it, even in this remote viewing state. So it's not just when you perceive it through their physical eyes, but even through remote viewing or non-locally. Perhaps there's some levers that we can pull there. And I'll give you another example of why I think this is really important. In some early, just very informal playing around and dabbling with remote viewing with my friend Sean McNamara in Denver. And I'm not sure if you know Sean. He's a Mind Possible guy. Does amazing stuff with PK and with remote viewing and meditation, etc. He ran a workshop and where we had numerous viewers, and they had targets and decoys. So the decoy is not the image that they're supposed to be viewing, but they each are assigned 2 images. And I had a little sketch of a volcano on mine, and it wasn't anything to do with my target or my decoy, but I had sketched this out. It was very vivid, but I kind of took it as like analytical overlay. I didn't pay much attention to it. I just noted it on the side. And then later, he and I were kind of reviewing some of the transcripts of the session, and he said, we had this really incredible phenomena where it was a clear case of displacement. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But he said that one of the people in the session, they had a target that was this like a riverbed and like the smooth stone river stones, or river stones in the bed, and it was kind of an interesting image. But the decoy was a volcano, this vivid volcano, and this person had drawn a vivid depiction of a volcano. So it's a miss because they were supposed to draw the pebbles, but it was such a clear hit. And then I had my transcript that I'm looking at. I'm like, well, there's my volcano. And I go home that night.
Were you guys in the same room, or was this done remotely?
No, we were all in the same room. This is years before COVID, and this is a no. You don't want to review transcripts like this. We were just kind of like exploring. This is not a formal protocol, and any RVer or RV trainer worth their salt would be like, you can't do that. But it's because of these corrupting influences.
Damon, it's not a coincidence.
No, but here's the thing. So I sketched this little volcano, and we were talking about displacement. I went home that evening, and I think my kids were in kindergarten, or one of them in kindergarten, and there's some papers on the counter, some drawings and stuff that they did in school. What do you think they drew?
Volcano.
And then I walked into the living room, and they were sitting there watching a movie. It was like Madagascar 2, and it's the scene where they're tossing the giraffe into the volcano. And later that night, when we got the kids to bed, my wife and I decided that we were going to watch a movie, and we sat down on the couch and we turned on the Roku player, and it has this scrawling screen of background, and there's like a robot climbing a building or something, and then a volcano. So there's like this bleed through effect. It's not limited to just the viewing session that this displacement happens. There's this underlying meaning that seemed to carry through. And I think that's fascinating. But that's not experimentally very tractable. It makes it very difficult to try to find your...
Okay, now this is where you and I were talking about free will before the show.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of a cool segue into that, where that would be very determined to me and not free willish. You know what I mean? Where suddenly this is all happening at the same time, and don't know why, but it seems to me to be predetermined that this volcano imagery and interaction was happening for a reason. And you know what I mean? And not by chance. And you didn't make the decision, right? You didn't make the decision for all of this happening, but it was happening. And does that pull the free will part of your life out of the play, and that this is all predetermined and was going to happen anyway?
For me, it didn't. No. It to me, it felt more like a tap on the shoulder, a reminder that we're in a much wider, interconnected web of meaning. That it's not just objects bouncing off each other in space. So I didn't take it to be more fatalistically driven. I took it as a real indicator of something important. And now I'm talking about it here, so the meaning continues, right? It becomes part of the fabric or a narrative that is a way of kind of contextualizing or interpreting some of these events. But I did want to kind of talk about why that is relevant to the work I'm doing now. So, experimentally, you want to try to draw an imaginary box. You want to isolate and test a specific phenomena, right? And in this case, in the lab, when we want to test remote viewing, we're not really interested in this cascading meaning effect or things like. We want to say like, how do we improve or optimize remote viewing, or like, what are some of the things that maybe make it more difficult or easier, or what are some of the mechanisms involved, perhaps. And so to do this effectively, we want to try to narrow the scope wherever possible and really isolate the thing of interest. And so one argument that's been made is that certain images might just be more dynamic or interesting or engaging. And this could be on an individual level. So perhaps that person that got the riverbed and the volcano, they just were more attracted to the volcano. But what my work is trying to do is try to look at on average, right? You can't predict any single person's response to an image, but we can say on average, if I take this specific image, how do people rate this across multiple dimensions? And now this allows me to control for that when I select my target sets. So if I want to run an experiment.
Okay, really quick, how many, and then you can continue, how many people are involved in this study in order to get an average of results?
Yeah, so the research team itself is myself, my advisor from my academic institution, Julia Mossbridge, and then from IONS, we have Helene Wabe and Cedric Kennard. So that's the research team. As far as participants, right now we've had over 2,000, well over 2,000 individuals. We have a curated database of 2,500 images. Each image has 18, let's say, psychological classes. So 18 questions about the image, like things like how abstract it is, or if it's first versus third person, does it feel like in your body, or do you experience it through your senses? Lots of questions to this in these different categories. For every question, there is a minimum of 15 individuals that have rated that. So any given image will have 18 times 15 ratings. So what this allows us to do is to look not just at like a single rater's response or even just the average response. We can look at that characteristic of the distribution of responses, that bell curve of responses for every image, for every dimension. Now, what this allows us to do, and now where I'm bringing in the artificial intelligence part, is to quantify the semantic space, like the objects, et cetera, that are involved in the image. And so let's say I had an image of a cemetery, but I wanted to find, let's say, images that were matched in terms of like numinosity or like supernatural presence, or maybe they're matched in interestingness, but vary in contents. So I get very different contents, but on average, there should be just as much kind of like, let's say, interesting or intrigue or dynamism that makes the viewer want to gravitate. So I'm kind of like trying to even the playing field so they don't have this boring rock versus volcano scenario in my target pools. Does this make sense? So this is ideally going to be an open source tool for researchers. Where I'm taking it, and this is, I can't speak too much to it yet because I'm waiting for some grant funding to come through, and hopefully I get the green light. But I'm working on processes to try to even look at taking the human out of the equation altogether, so that you would have an experiment that is tasked by AI, meaning that the AI in combination with a random event generator is selecting the targets and the decoys based on selected parameters, that the AI is judging the viewing transcripts by taking the transcripts that the viewer provides and matching them based on the image target, based on semantic properties and visual properties, as compared to other possible targets, and also potentially looking at AI viewing, so that the artificial system is creating its own transcripts. And this really begs some really interesting questions, but I can't go into too much depth here now. Maybe if you have me on again in a couple of years, we'll see. But yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting potentials. But the database itself, we think, will be a very useful tool for the field. And this is not just specific to parapsychology or remote viewing. That's why my old lab is involved in it as well. I think there's a lot of applications for traditional psychology. We're just trying to make a useful tool set, and we will make it open source and available for other researchers to use. So, yeah, and I think we owe it to the public, considering we've taken so many man hours to produce this thing. There's so much human involvement to create this set. It's a massive undertaking, and I think it's going to pay off.
Let me ask you an abstract question. It's kind of a thought experiment to some degree. Do you think it is possible for AI to look at a control image and then produce results the same way a human perceives the image?
Well, this is potentially an empirical question, right? We should be able to ask this through experimentation. Even if it did,
I mean, have AI answer the same 18 questions, right?
yeah. Oh, I see the ratings.
Yeah.
I'm actually working on a pre-registered study to test that very question. And so when I say pre-register, I have the data to ask this question, but I want to document it through an open science framework, so that I kind of said and laid out exactly what I intend to do and how I intend to do it, so that people don't, it doesn't seem like it's a retrofitting. But yes, I've been working with some models that just a couple preliminary tests seem to be able to guess the ratings or guess the average rating, and seem to do it fairly well and within the confidence intervals, meaning that it doesn't differ meaningfully from chance from the actual user's ratings. If that's the case, if it's successful, then we can, in phase 2, we can expand this data set tremendously, because we wouldn't rely on humans having to engage with every photo and rate every photo. So you could have essentially like an evergreen set. The other question is what another empirical question I think is interesting is when we think about remote viewing as a process, sometimes we think of images as being a proxy for locations to some extent. But what about AI generated images of imaginal spaces? Are viewers going to differ on those? Is it really the image itself? Is it the location? Is it the semantics that they're picking up on? Is it the feedback? People argue that it's the feedback. It's the reveal of the image that they're really honing in on. It's like you're tapping into your future self and the experience of having the image revealed. That's important. These are all not fully resolved questions. There are certainly cases there's legendary cases of Pat Price, who passed on before some of her targets were revealed, but they were revealed to be very, very, very accurate. So it certainly wasn't personal feedback that was driving that, but it was revealed eventually. So there is maybe collective conscious feedback. I don't know. I don't know if it's feedback or if it's meaning, but back to your question, yes, I think it's possible that an AI might be able to approximate these subjective ratings. It might be more accurate in some cases than others. You know, some of the really abstract concepts like numinosity, I don't know if it's going to do a good job or not. We'll see.
Doesn't that scare the crap out of you? Right? I mean, what if? Right? What if? And we start to take these steps, and then the next natural thing, if that is successful, to think about precog or remote viewing done with AI and with software. And is that a possibility? And then now we're talking about parapsychology, like in a pure definition of weirdness. Do you think it will ever get to that point?
I speculate that this is why I'm in this research direction. You know, I think it's certainly possible. Yes, it is terrifying. What's terrifying is not the tool; it's the first to mind use cases. Just like remote viewing is terrifying for that same reason, right? Like, I mean, I find that I'm kind of close and colleagues with people that came out of the government programs for remote viewing. And I had really strong opinions about that until I'd met some of these people personally, like people like Paul Smith, for example, who I'm very fond of. I think he's an incredible guy. Lynn Buchanan, I thought was an amazing person. I mean, when I've actually interacted with these people, I find them to be incredible. That aside, just like the OBE thing, right? Like if you have an out-of-body experience, you've just recognized yourself as a multidimensional consciousness. Can we not think of something better to do than go spy on your ex-girlfriend or something like that, right? The use cases that come to mind with these things are often very mundane compared to what their actual implications are. If you had, let's say, precog in general, any kind of psi phenomena in general, should be just mind-blowing as a question, because it's pointing to a much deeper reality than this physical matter that we're used to experiencing. Your first out-of-body experience can be the most transformative thing in the world, because you've just now recognized yourself as a multidimensional being, right? That's profound. And yet, when we think about these things as tools, we instantly go to like weaponization or gaming the market somehow and getting a competitive edge. Like, how do I make this physical reality that we've already established is not as important as this superseding consciousness reality? But how do we make this little physical thing a little bit better or a little bit more competitive? That's not the direction I care to go with it. That's not my interest at all. What my interest is exploring technologies that might help, acting like a little thing, like a key that opens a bigger door. And that bigger door is a bigger door of awareness that we step through. And I think that ethically, the more we start to realize this hyper interconnected web of consciousness that we actually exist in, that it might change our space of interaction, right? To be less transactional and a little bit more, let's say, holistically ethical, if that makes sense.
Well, at some point we have to become earthlings, right? We have to, and I don't know when that point is going to be, but there is, people talk about the singularity and these things, and those are real concerns, and I get that, but there will be a point where we cross from the position we're in now into the next stage of evolution, right? And which is what you're talking about, right there. And this is where ET comes in to, right, where we know that the universe is a big place, Damon. It's we can't wrap our head around how big it actually is. We can't. And there is life out there. And even if it got a jump start on us by 100 years, look how far we've come in 100 years, right? Mm-hmm. So they would have a firm understanding of these concepts that we struggle with today. And that's what I'm talking about. There will be a point where we take that step in evolution and understand that there's something else going on here besides your mortgage and going to work and right. And I just don't know. I think we're getting closer though. And the other part to this is science, and especially your science and our community, our tinfoil hat crazy ass community that I love so dearly, is it's going to collide, right? Because they're both wondering about the same things and both support each other. And I think when they do collide is when we take that step, and at least in the general direction of moving on in evolution.
Yeah. Well said. Well said.
What the other part about this that I find so fascinating, and we were talking about free will, is that some non-spiritual, right, atheist scientist with no concerns about anything except for chemistry and numbers, right? Everything else doesn't matter, right? Has deja vu. They do. They probably see ghosts too as well. But that's an indication of something else going on that can't be quantified, cannot be measured, cannot be put into a laboratory, but yet the experience happens and it is part of our reality. And how do we explain something like how does science explain something that is experienced by everybody on this planet? How does deja vu fall into this category? Because I think deja vu overlaps with everything that we're talking about right now. And that is something that an atheist, pragmatic, black and white, ones and zeros, binary thinking physicist, scientist experiences. Right? So how does that phenomena fit into their world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are even many parapsychologists I know, including people like Julia Mossbridge, take a more, or I guess a less of a mystical interpretation of deja vu experiences. But I can use a different analogy. I know since you love to talk about dreaming, let's go back to dreaming. We all take it for granted. For the most part, people have had at least one dream experience, right? So it's just kind of, we don't really question it. We have these periods of time when we hit the pillow, and then we have this other kind of experience state, and then we come back to this, and we accept that we're back in this reality, and no one questions that. But imagine, just as a thought experiment, that you were the one person that was having these experiences, and everyone else, it was like lights out when they went to sleep, and then they woke up. Well, no one would believe your experience, right? They would say it was like some kind of confabulation, or some retroactive memory effect, etc. And so it's only by virtue. There's no evidence, hard, fast, unassailable evidence for dreaming. At least there wasn't up until a couple of years ago. Like you can map the neural activity like through EEG, and you can find these different patterns of activity that roughly correspond to like their analogs during the daytime, which is like alpha, beta, gamma, theta, etc., and delta. But that doesn't tell you anything about the subjective contents. So it's only by virtue of the fact that we all have had dreams and we corroborate it that we accept this as a phenomena, that it's just part of our day-to-day experience. So it's okay. We're okay with that. But then you have certain things that are a little bit more anomalous, like seeing a deceased entity. And it's the same thing. Like some people see ghosts and some people don't. And the people that don't are much more likely to think like that was probably, some kind of confabulation or hallucination or what have you. And so it's easy to kind of like, keep at arm's distance some of these things. And I think another part of your question, though, is like people that, let's say, hardcore physical reductionist scientists still have these weird mystical experiences. but they happen on the fringes of their reality space. They're not the mean, they're not the average or the middle. And so they're easy to kind of relegate to the fringes and maybe not even think, like, just look, my hands are kind of leaving the screen. They're like kind of outside of our normal day-to-day influences. Like we tend to like easily just kind of like put them out of mind, Whereas when you start to acknowledge them and talk about them and you find other people that are doing them, they start to become more and more towards that mean. That's that kind of consensus reality shift that happens. And when we start to acknowledge these things, an example is a near-death experience is a great example, because if you had an NDE in the 70s, there wasn't really even a technical term for it in the States. And the only hypotheses that were plausible was either like, the act of the devil if you came from a religious upbringing, or some kind of psychopathology if you came from a scientific upbringing, right? Those are really the only ways to couch that experience. But now we have so much corroboration. So many people have had experiences that there's a way of processing through and acknowledging these things and working through them and understanding them and having a language for them. And I think that's what's making them more real. But I'm afraid to rambling, but I want to tell a story of an exercise I did in one of my classes that I think was kind of illuminating to this. So I taught a class on research methods, and I did one class of that semester or quarter about this kind of problem of like what's science and what's pseudoscience, right? And it's pretty much clear in most people's mind what's science and what's pseudoscience. But to drive this point home, I gave them a survey to do it the night before the class, and we took several topics. And they took the slider and they moved it either towards science or towards pseudoscience, depending on their opinion on it. I took things like organic chemistry, astrophysics, flat earth theory, intelligent design, the near-death experiences, ghosts and apparitions, and after-death communications, right? And so for each topic, we unpacked it in the class and we discussed it. And I showed them the distribution of their ratings and see like where did we have agreement. And most of the things like astrophysics and stuff were pretty soundly in the science column. There's a couple that were a little bit, mixed. But let's take the ghost example since you brought that up.
I knew you were going there. Yeah, right.
Resoundingly, the class agreed that this is purely the domain of pseudoscience. This is not a scientific topic. But then I asked the question, how many of you here in this class, either like your parents or yourself, have seen a ghost? 5 out of 25 kids raised their hand. So like, what is that? Now, you have to agree about the mechanism. We don't have to say that just because you experienced seeing a ghost, that means you literally saw a deceased entity or spirit, right? But we can agree that we've had this experience. And if we have now relegated this to the realm of pseudoscience, now we're not even allowing ourselves to ask the question. The question itself becomes taboo. It's out of the purview of investigation. That's a problem. Because science and pseudoscience, there's no line of demarcation. There's no way to clearly delineate between these things. There's no hard and fast rule that you can say, this is science, this is not. But you can say, like, what is a good approach to a question? And a scientific approach to a question, I think, in a lot of times is the correct approach, okay? And we should not have questions that we don't allow ourselves to ask because they're pseudoscience-y or taboo or what have you. One of my mentors, who was very influential on me as a graduate student, Chip Reichard, had written a book called the multi-hypothetical method, I believe. It's kind of it's a philosophy of science around the scientific method. And when we think of the scientific method and the way you learned it in school and the way, I learned it is that you make some observations and you start to develop some theories, and then you create a testable hypotheses and you collect some data and you revise your hypotheses or update and you test again, you kind of iterate. And it's a very linear, straightforward process. And this is the scientific method. This is the canonical scientific method. But it's not actually the full method. it's not that you create a hypothesis and you test that hypothesis. You look at the data, not just in accordance with the hypothesis, but in accordance of numerous alternative hypotheses, right? So let's put the ghost aside and let's talk about flat Earth theory, which I'm sorry, I don't know. Maybe some of your viewers are pretty into it. I'm not personally, but let's take the flat Earth theory. There was a great documentary on Netflix about this, and they were actually conducting scientific experiments and collecting data. And the data, sometimes affirms their theory that the Earth is indeed flat. But the problem is they did not consider. It's like a foregone conclusion that the Earth is flat, and they're trying to collect data to affirm that position. And they're not considering the alternative hypothesis that the Earth is round. And had they have done so, they would have found that the data that they gathered, while it is in accordance with the flat Earth theory, it's in even better accordance with the round Earth theory.
That's right.
So when people talk about scientific proof, that's a misnomer. There's only scientific evidence. We never have definitive proof of anything. You have an approaching 100% confidence, but you never have 100% confidence. And so when we think about now the ghost thing, you don't have to believe that it's a disincarnate entity. It could be hallucination. It could be a chemical imbalance. It could be an apparition like light show. It could be anything. But by not allowing us to even ask the question, this is a big, big problem. And now we have phenomena with the UFO and UAP phenomena, right? Where like now this stuff is starting to come out and we're starting to see this hit more of the mainstream. Yet my students are all calling it pseudoscience. And within months after the whole like stories of the Navy pilots on CNN, and it's like mainstream, right? So like it's happening. It's not a matter of question. Now you don't have to necessarily say it's extraterrestrial visitors. Maybe you have other hypotheses, or maybe it's earthbound, but we see that the phenomena is happening and we're not allowing ourselves to rigorously investigate it because it's pseudoscience. Does that make sense? And so what I take issue with oftentimes are these, given a philosophy of science. The philosophy of science is this omni-questioning principle. We are never confident. We never have bedrock. You have to be very comfortable with ambiguity. You never lose it. If you lose it, then you stop asking questions. Okay. And so we conflate science with a collection of facts. Science says that this is how matter works, and therefore consciousness cannot work like that. Well, no, science doesn't say that. Science is just a method of asking questions. It's not a collection of facts. And as a scientist, if you have an unassailable bedrock of belief, then you are really limited to what you can learn or the questions you can ask, because you will never revise those fundamental assumptions. And the whole ethos of science is, as new data come in, as new observations are made, we then have to like revise and append our foregone conclusions and our precious ideas and our precious theories and our precious beliefs. We are willing to throw those out as new information comes in. And
That's
unfortunately,
right.
many of us in the community just are not willing to do so.
That's right. That's right. And where scientists and physicists and the fans of those rock stars have it wrong is this. The fans and those that stay in the lane forget the basic principle. Science is nothing but a series of corrections. That's all it is. That's all it is. That's what science is. It's a series of corrections. And you can go back to the beginning of everything and see the process of how everything just gets fine-tuned and corrected. If your goal is to be a physicist, you better have some thick skin, because what you do today is going to be wrong tomorrow. That's science, right? That's it. That's it. And and to address directly what you just said, somewhere along the line, we stopped asking questions. If you go back to Einstein, and I don't get that. We just stopped going, well, why? I don't know. Okay, let's go check that out. We've lost that, right? And if you go back to Einstein, where he thought he didn't see, he had nothing to prove, but that light, we could see a light or a star behind another object, and the light would move around it, and we would see it, even though there was an object in between. Now that's crazy, but he saw it in his mind, and he thought about it and said, "How?" Okay, went and explored, wrote the math. It wasn't proven until we had an eclipse 4 years later. Right. And so when the photography came in for the eclipse and was like, holy crap, Einstein was right. Well, it's because he thought outside of the box. Right. This is an idea that doesn't make sense to anybody. And we've lost that. We've lost that childlike wonderment of the world in science. And to address your point, and we're going through that now, and it frustrates me. When we get into the world of parapsychology and near-death experiences and remote viewing and pre-cog, deja vu is a great example of this, right? Well, what is actually going on here? Well, we know something's going. Let's study this for real. Let's take this serious. Yeah. This is not pseudoscience. This is part of our everyday life, Damon.
Yeah, exactly. And the people I know that are researching this stuff are extra careful. They're high quality scientists, even though we like to paint them with the pseudoscientist brush. Like they imagine that they're all like kind of flaky crystal hugger woo, like seance people. Well, no, actually they're very rigorous and methodical and very, very careful with their data and very thoughtful. But we all have these blind spots. Every single one of us has some blind spots, and I think that there's also this tendency to believe in knowledge, even when it shows the knowledge you've accumulated tells you that you're not in control. There's a sense of control and prediction. So where I guess I have sympathy for an understanding of the material reductionist scientist is that by trying to put reality in a box and say, like, throw free will out and things that we don't really want to deal with, we have this very narrow box of lens that we can view the world, but it also gives a sense of comfort and control, even though you're saying we have no control, that it's hard determinism, right? Because it's predictable. Just like if you put a rat in a cage with electrical shocks that are predicted on a schedule versus electrical shocks that are random and intermittent, the randomly shocked rat is going to have a much higher stress response because it's this hypervigilance. Whereas the rat that it can at least accept that these shocks are going to come on a regular cadence can, have a little bit of more faculty towards adjusting and preparing for, etc. So the same case is true. In both cases, the shocks are not within the control of the rat, but the rat that can believe that can at least predict them feels a little bit more agency around it. And I think just like the scientist that wants to have knowledge instead of questions starts to feel like, maybe they have a little bit more control in their world. That's just my guess, but I don't know.
No, you're right. They want to play in the safe zone, psychologically, right? They want to play in the safe zone because they have a general fear of the unknown, and that is the shock to the system if it happens. Richard Dawkins, I love picking on Richard Dawkins because he thinks he's smart, but he's a doofus, right? Okay. And he truly is. But anyway, he said he cracked a joke one day. He was telling a truth, but he cracked a joke, and it really showed me who he really is. So we know he's an atheist, right? And we know that he thinks he's the smartest man on the planet. So we have these two issues, and that nothing beyond our reality is worth concerning. Okay, all right. So we get that. But then he says this, his words, not mine. He won't go in to a haunted house. Now, wait a minute. You can't have right. You can't have it. You can't have it both ways. You can't either, right? Either you are steadfast in your belief system, right, or not. You can't have it both ways. You can't be afraid of ghosts and a haunted house and have fear, and be a reductionist atheist. You can't have it both ways.
Yeah, this is probably more common though. I've met neuroscientists that are hardcore reductionists, and they think that consciousness is part of the brain. And I remember I was working in it's kind of as a research admin, for a conference, and it was an fMRI training conference, and the neuroscientist that put on this conference had to write a check for some of the stuff. It was like this total like Jesus check. Like, so clearly he's a very religious guy, but it's like the religious guy over here and then the scientist hat, and I think we all do that. We all wear a lot of hats, and it's sometimes easy to compartmentalize, but we should always be aware of where we have these kind of contradicting philosophies even within the self. And there's also kind of like institutionalized beliefs too. And the way we express ourselves working within an institution is different than our own personal experiences.
Right.
I've met very, very great, rigorous professors, etc., that, they find out that I'm into this crazy stuff. And I've talked to many people that are like, I don't believe in any of that stuff, it's just, but there was that one time.
Yeah,
when you get him talking,
right.
That one time is like, it's not even something mundane, like deja vu. It's something like, I met one professor that had a near-death experience. I had another one that had like a dream about a deceased parent that visited them in the dream before they knew that the parent had deceased. This stuff happens all the time. And so again, that's kind of relegated to the periphery of our experience. We don't really consider it. It's not affecting us on a day-to-day basis, so it's easy to kind of write it off. But my experience has been, once we start to acknowledge and turn our attention towards these things, it's almost like giving them license to occur more frequently. And that's kind of gets into that consensus reality. When you're in a culture and embedded within a culture that takes these things as more commonplace, then suddenly they start to occur more frequently. Perhaps they occur the same rate, but we're just acknowledging it and talking about it, or perhaps the conditions are right for these things to actually emerge. I don't know. But I do think that there's this institutional thing of like way we try to structure that kind of like regiments the type of appropriate ways of thinking in a certain context. But then the whole lid gets blown off of that when we start to really consider our real personal experiences and how they fit into that.
Today, what I'm really enjoying is, well, I'm enjoying it because it's happening, but what I'm really enjoying is the idea of the Big Bang, which is part, I'm just going to say dogma. I love the word, right? Because it's been repeated so much that is now been established, at least in most minds, as scientific fact. That's what things have been based on. And 13.8 billion years and the beginning of time. And before that, there was nothing. Where today, there is actual discussion in scientific circles that maybe the Big Bang didn't happen at all. And that we've always been here, and that it's not 13.8 billion years, and that and forever is a long time, right? It's a long time, and infinity is a damn big number. It's also damn small, right? It's forever, and maybe that's the way it is. Well, if that's the case, are we getting into a serious intelligent design conversation? Are we getting into something more spiritual? Is consciousness what is driving the universe? Is there something else that has existed forever? Right? Forever, not 13.8 billion years. but forever. And that's where things are starting to lean. And I love it, because if they go in that direction, they've got a whole lot to unpack and unravel, don't they?
Yeah, I think it's exciting to think the amount of strangeness that's out there and that's possible. I kind of hold off from having any really strong opinions about that with respect to the origin of the universe, but I love to speculate that it's not at all the way we likely conceive it. And I think that's true with most things, that the underlying reality is probably a lot stranger than what we interpret it as.
Oh, yeah. You know, there, like I said, we're going to cross that line in evolution. And I don't know when it's going to happen or what's going to be revealed. But in the words of Giorgio Tsoukalos, we're going to all find out that we were all wrong. And it's going to be great when it happens. It's going to be great when it happens. Damon, where can everybody follow your work and reach out?
I'm easily reachable on LinkedIn, and I love to connect with people, collaborators, or people that are interested in this work, and happy to connect. That's probably the best way. I think maybe in the session notes you might have put a link to my my personal website where you can see some of my previous lectures and creative projects, and read about some of my research projects, etc. I think those are probably the best way to find me.
Fascinating conversation tonight, and I look forward to the next one.
Yeah, thank you.
As they always say, keep rolling that rock uphill, because that's exactly what you're doing. Damon, thank you so much, my friend. Great night on the show. We appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Damon Abraham. Now, the links for Damon are below. We have them over on our website and throughout social media. That was a perfect show tonight. Absolutely perfect. And now I am heading into the weekend. I haven't had time off for what seems like months, but I'm looking forward to tonight and the weekend. But another week of Fade to Black starts on Monday. Fade to Black is produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee Newman, and Michelle Freed. Thank you, John Aside. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Dennis. And thank you, Kevin. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldrich. Intro, Spaceboy. SpaceboyMusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Game Changer Network. And this broadcast is owned and copyrighted 2024 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network, Inc. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black of the Game Changer Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Until Monday, I want you to have a great, safe, fun, and amazing weekend. Go Backley Tappy.